at this time, we would like to welcome Hiba Krisht. Hiba Krisht is a writer, editor, and translator from Beirut. She was raised in one of the most insular and conservative Shiite Muslim communities in the world and apostated from the faith 10 years ago. As a volunteer activist with the Exmuslims of North America, she has spoken about the intersections of Islam, Middle Eastern politics, and women's rights at secular humanist events all over the country. She is particularly passionate about advocacy surrounding Muslim modesty doctrine as an ex-hijabi who covered for 15 years, starting from the age of 8. Her retired blog, Between a Veil and a Dark Place, was hosted on the Free Thought Blogs network, and its archives can still be found in the Exmuslims at www.theexmuslim.com. Hiba holds a MA in philosophy from the American University of Beirut. Her academic specialty is political secularism and practical reason, but she has also taught ethics, logic, writing, gender studies, and political science in U.S. and Lebanese universities. As a technical translator and editor, she consults with the World Bank on several educational development projects for Arab governments. She also translates and edits excerpts from the Arabic language presses for Mideast Mirror, a daily newspaper in translation. Hiba's writing appear in literary journals such as the Kenyan Review, Blackbird, Hayden's Ferry Review, and Misna, among others. She is a recipient of the 2016 Rebecca Mitchell Tarumoto Short Fiction Prize from Virginia Commonwealth University, the 2013 Joanne Afanis Memorial Award in Literature from the National Society of Arts and Letters, and the 2012 Jane Folks Malone Fellowship from Indiana University. She has been interviewed about her life and work for Vice, The Humanist Hour, and BBC Radio, among others. Please welcome Hiba Krisht.
That's a great start. Good afternoon. I am supremely honored to be here. This is a truly special place. Thank you to Black Nonbelievers, Black Skeptics, and the Women's Leadership Project for organizing this amazing conference. I've thought a lot about what to focus this talk on. You see, I've spoken at many secular-themed conferences in advocacy of the ex-Muslim cause. I've covered many topics, but to be quite honest, I usually focus on the very particular and horrific brand of misogyny girls and women in Muslim communities worldwide contend with. And when I talk about that very particular and horrific brand of misogyny girls and women in Muslim communities contend with, I often become very aware of a palpable discomfort in the room. The suggestion that there is rampant misogyny in Muslim communities makes people who are, let's say, trying their best to be allies, panic. And so then I hedge, of course. You know that thing where you have to take a minute to calm their discomfort so they don't dismiss you. Although, if someone were giving a talk to the very same audience about the very particular and horrific misogyny girls and women in white American Christian communities contend with, they would not have to hedge in the same way. But I say my piece, and then come the questions. I've been told everything from, don't you think this perpetuates Islamophobia/racism/anti-Muslim bigotry, to doesn't this deny the declared lived experience of Muslim women? And then, citing people like, actually, I'm not gonna go there. Citing people who are front and center as advocates of their free choice to adhere to things such as hijab in Muslim communities, for instance, just as an example. All of this is to say that in a very real way, when we are talking about the intersections of misogyny and oppression, when it comes to this very particular brand of religious community, especially when we were talking about it from the position of being in the West, there is a kind of like fraught double standard that we have to contend with that often ends up throwing up obstacles in our face that other people do not have to contend with when they are trying to speak of their own struggles with the type of misogyny that is perpetuated by religious doctrines. Our bodies are battlegrounds, doubly so because there is this phenomenon that happens where the racism that is perpetuated against us and against our communities, especially the racism that's perpetuated against men in our communities, the stereotypes that our men are more aggressive, are more regressive, that they are more prone to violence, and so on, ends up enabling a very insidious type of racism and violence against them. But then it is on our shoulders as women to not speak out about our own issues, to not speak out about the violence and misogyny that we face at the hands of our men, lest we perpetuate the stereotype, I wanted to speak briefly about an incident that happened the last time this conference was held. Was it 2019? Yeah. And the reason this incident kind of was the reason I decided to focus on this for my talk, because it was a very specific and telling example of exactly how this dynamic can play out even in the safest of places, even in a place where the majority of the people in the room are of color, even in a place where there isn't so much anxiety about catering to the gaze of our white allies and their own anxieties about about wanting to be good allies and not wanting to perpetuate racism against us, and that ending up obscuring what we say is more concerning or most concerning to us. So last year, the keynote speaker was Sadia Hamid from the Council of Exmuslims of Britain. She came in and she gave this wonderful, wonderful talk talking about the brilliant work that she and the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain do to help women and people in general from the most insular and disadvantaged positions to basically get the help that they don't find elsewhere because no one else understands their issues or really knows how to get them the type of advocacy and support that they need. So she was very eloquent about it. And then during the Q&A, someone stood up and asked the very valid question about how do you navigate the tension and the intersection between dealing with speaking about how these are issues that people contend with in your community and that you need to address, and then having that not perpetuate the more violence and racism against people from because Muslim communities are they're communities of color, I honestly don't remember what Sadia's response was, but I do remember a conversation that happened immediately after the talk, because it wasn't the person who had asked the question, but it was a white woman who was responding to the person who asked the question, who came up to her afterwards and was saying, "I'm really glad that you raised that issue, because I'm really concerned about the imperialist policies that kill and maim Muslim women globally." And essentially, her critique boiled down to, what about the war on Iraq? And the person who had asked the question wasn't from a Muslim background, didn't know how to answer the question. So I tried to come in and speak about it because I have a lot of experience in this. It's basically what I do. And I found myself being gatekeeped by this white woman. I found myself feeling like I had to justify whether or not the work that I and my peers did sufficiently addressed a problem that affects us that affects our sisters and our mothers, that we live in a sort of generational trauma kind of way through our bodies. Like I come from refugees several times over. I'm an immigrant several times over. My grandfather was displaced from Palestine. My father was born in a refugee camp. My mother's family came to the US fleeing the Lebanese civil war. We went back to the Middle East to try to reconnect to our roots. And then we ended up having to come back to this side of the country, this side of the world, sorry, because literally the Middle East has become unlivable. And this is something that is very, very personal. The kind of experiences that I had when I was still a hijabi, when I was still a visibly Muslim woman, the kind of experiences that I know my sister and my mother face, the kind of issues that we contend with, that basically that are like imprinted in our DNA and in our bodies everywhere we go. This white woman was trying to ask me whether we are doing enough to address those issues when we are also trying to talk about things like how horrifically oppressive and dehumanizing the very particular brand of Muslim purity culture that comes with the hijab, not just as a mode of dress, but as a doctrine, as a set of behaviors. And she was demanding examples of the ways in which we engaged in anti-racist discourse and that we basically incorporated that into our work. And the contention I felt was that it felt like we had to justify even having these concerns to begin with before we were able to start speaking about them. And why? And this wasn't coming from someone who was coming from a perspective of consciously wanting to enable white supremacy. This was coming from someone who was coming from an anti-racist perspective, who is ironically, in their very attempt to not gatekeep, is gatekeeping. Because the anxiety that they have about advertently or inadvertently perpetuating racism against us ends up silencing us, because they don't realize how much space they take up. And they don't realize how exhausting and exhausted these hoops that we have to jump through over and over again just to be heard are. The truth is, I don't know anything about who that woman is. I don't know where she's been or what she does or what she's seen. I don't know, I don't know what connections she may or may not have to the Middle East. I don't know if she personally knows any Iraqi women, because she seemed to be so concerned about them. I don't know if she knows Arabic. I don't know any of that, but I know who I am. And I know how galling it is to be told by an outsider that my concerns are misplaced. I'm a Lebanese woman, I'm a Palestinian woman, I'm an immigrant, I'm a lesbian. I wore hijab for 15 years, starting from the age of 8 years old. I was kidnapped and tortured by a terrorist organization when I tried to run away. I'm a translator for a living. I translate news from the Middle East every single day, all across the political spectrum. I translate educational development for Iraq, for Gaza and the West Bank, for Palestine, for Saudi Arabia, and for Yemen. To be gatekeeped is beyond the pale, but it happens, and it happens by our allies, our white allies, everywhere we go. And I have little doubt that with the majority of our allies, the intent is good, that it's born of an honest wariness against enabling bigotry against Muslims and a careful assessment of their own positionality as outsiders to the situation at hand. But here's the thing. I'm just trying to find the right way to say it. this is basically just falling into an inverse version of the white savior complex. Of basically, instead of wanting to swoop in and save all of these oppressed women from brown communities, from the Middle East, from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, you know, from their regressive governments and their regressive cultures and so on, it's basically doing the thing where you get so defensive of these cultures that you end up sweeping all the terrible things about them under the rug, under the assumption that there is no way to speak about the very real and horrific phenomenon and systemic forms of injustice that are perpetuated in and on our communities without enabling racism against us, even though there are so many ways in which the very same discourse happens and happens is navigated very, very skillfully, I think, when it comes to talking about misogyny and homophobia and systemic injustice in white communities and in Christian communities all over the world, but especially in America. And the same kind of the same mechanisms of that discourse are applicable, but somehow they just seem to, I don't know, they fly out of people's brains or something like that, because the anxiety is so palpable that, you know, that it's like trying to put up blinkers, to ignore the problem, to pretend that there is no problem, to pretend that we don't contend with violence, that we don't contend with misogyny, that there isn't a systemic issue. And part of the problem that I see here is that one of positionality is that it is very, very easy for white allies to point to someone that they can look at and uphold as a representative of the community that they are trying to defend, and say, well, this person, you know, defends the hijab or talks about the freedom of choice and so on and so on. And who am I to say that, like, I know better than they do about what is going on in their communities. And the thing is that the thing is that this is just so doubly ironic, because when you have an intersection of marginalized identities, such that you are not only a woman and or a queer person from an immigrant community that happens to be particularly insular and particularly prone and vulnerable to systemic injustices, but when you are also someone who is a bit of a pariah or is kind of goes outside of the fold from within that community, when you are not the person whose voice would be upheld and supported because you do not support the cultural zeitgeist within that community, then you are already silenced by default. And the people who are silencing you are the ones that are supported by the people who are purporting to be your allies. So, you are not ever going to hear a proud feminist Muslim voice criticizing the hijab, because that is not the voice that is going to be elevated. That is the voice that is already silenced. That is the voice that already has way too many pressures to remain silent, and the mechanisms of pressure are the same everywhere. You know, it's not just a woman's like physical safety. We happen to come from most Muslim communities, mainstream Muslim communities, to the most like fundamentalist and hardline Muslim communities, tend to be very communal cultures. They tend to be cultures where you cannot survive, you cannot get married, you cannot have a community, you cannot build a family, you cannot go to school, you cannot be employed without the overt support of your family and your community, which means that the costs of stepping out and speaking out are extremely high. And the women who do try to, from within the fold, who do try to raise very urgent criticisms about the inequalities that women in Muslim communities face, they tend to deal with the most vicious types of pressure and the most vicious types of criticism and blackballing that end up just silencing them before they can make any progress. And these are the women that are being silenced when someone's anxieties about perpetuating racism against a community that already contends with racism, and that's not going to change. It's not going to change if you refuse to cast the spotlight on issues that feel uncomfortable. I'm going to give a few examples. Okay. Examples of gatekeeping disguised as the opposite. So I'm gonna start with a big one, female genital mutilation. Female genital mutilation, FGM, is a problem that is extremely pervasive and difficult, that certain, not all, definitely not all Muslim communities have to deal with, mostly in Africa. For instance, in Egypt, I think it was a 2015 or 2016 poll, a fairly recent poll showed that between 85 and 90% of women and girls aged 15 and older had undergone FGM. And this is actually changing. So the Egyptian parliament quite recently passed a bill, first of all, criminalizing female genital mutilation. It was not criminalized before. And then they passed another bill later on because, criminalizing something doesn't stop it. It's not sufficient. They passed a bill, enacting certain types of punishments. And then later on, a few years later, they enacted another bill, basically revising the punishments to make sure that they were more severe so that the deterrence would actually work. Because you can't just write something into law and then it changes a cultural phenomenon that is so pervasive and is part of people's understanding, across this vast country. Egypt is a very, very big country. But part of what ended up changing the cultural discourse that eventually ended up introducing the new legislation to try to change this so that future generations of people assigned a female at birth do not have to contend with FGM. Part of the cultural conversation was spearheaded by women in the medical industry, women in the legal industry, who basically everywhere that they turned, they were silenced and they were attacked. A very big example is Nawal al-Saadawi, who recently passed away, but she was a firebrand Egyptian feminist who her life's work was basically speaking out against FGM. She was a physician, and she was basically she lost her job. She worked for the government. She worked because public health is basically the main health sector in Egypt. She lost her job. She became unemployable. She basically she was demonized and she had to leave the country and live in exile for a while. But her work was instrumental to criminalizing FGM in Egypt. The thing is, when I look at the scholarly discourse about things like FGM, that's not where the focus is. The focus is all too often on trying to hedge and explain and culturally contextualize it in a way that makes it more palatable for people, for outsiders essentially, to accept as this is the practice of another culture and we can't really criticize it. There was one study in particular that was extremely galling to read about because this anthropologist went and spent time with a community and she spoke to people who it was kind of like a rite of passage to undergo FGM before they got married. And she spoke to some women who defended the practice and who were looking forward to engaging in it themselves. And her takeaway from this was that, well, as an outsider, I am not in a position to judge, and this is what they are saying about it. Ignoring the fact that we have no problem recognizing that most types of misogyny and most types of systemic oppression against women are enabled and perpetuated by women. And that's part of one of the essential mechanics by which they operate, because there's no other way to do it. Like the modesty culture and the policing that happens to girls and women's bodies, it comes from our mothers, it comes from our elders. It's a type of indoctrination that is passed down, and it passed down through explicitly female vehicles as part of, like, that's part of how it works. And instead of addressing that and critiquing that, the anxiety of being an outsider, of not wanting to, even something as horrific and you would think blatant and like clear cut as FGM, that we can see this in scholarly discourse. It's mind boggling to me. Another one is upholding Muslim women as paragons. I already talked about that. One example that I do want, that I think that here in the US, that has faced ex-Muslim organizing, this is like not as severe at all, but like, so the Ex-Muslims of North America is, I believe, the first and only advocacy group for apostates from Islam in the continent. And everywhere we turn, there is there is resistance. There's this resistance even within the secular community and the secular movement, because it is people recognize that we deal with issues that are more fraught and that are more difficult to navigate, and there's an anxiety surrounding it. So there was this this billboard campaign that XMNA was trying to get off the ground a while ago, and it took something like a year from when the ads were made, and they were very, very benign ads. It was something like, questioning or not, or you don't believe in Islam, you're not alone, and then like the ex-Muslim website. And every major city, I think there were 20 cities that they tried to get this billboard put up. No one would do it. No one wanted to put it up. It ended up in 3 cities. Only 3 cities allowed it. It was Atlanta, Chicago, can't remember the third one. And that's part of why the process took so long, because people, they hear ex-Muslim and they're like, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Another one, this is just, again, very small. It was like the 3 or 4 year anniversary of XMNA, basically just a cake that says ex-Muslims of North America. Bakery wouldn't make it. Stuff like that, just the notion that you are trying to step outside and be very, very explicit about criticizing this type of community is very, very uncomfortable to people. Another way in which this gatekeeping manifests is in, I think, well-meaning but essentially misguided comparisons and drawing parallels between the type of purity and modesty culture and the type of misogyny that people in Muslim communities face and the type that is faced in Christian communities, which is not to say that it is not horrific in Christian communities. It is, but in some ways, some parallels cannot be drawn and should not be drawn, and some parallels simply, it's simply insulting to draw them. So one of them is comparing the hijab to the habits that nuns wear, or even worse, comparing a form of dress like the niqab, which is the face covering, to another like extreme form of dress that's like normalized in the West, which is the bikini, and going like, well, they both objectify women and reduce them to their bodies, and they're the same. This blatantly ignores the systemic factors that end up enabling this type of culture and these types of practices, is such that there's really no comparing the scale and the enormity of it. Like, so the nun thing and then the hijab thing. So in most schools of Muslim jurisprudence, the hijab is considered mandatory. It's considered something that if you do not wear the hijab, you will go to hell. If you do not dress modestly, God will be displeased with you and you will go to hell. And the hijab, again, is not just a garment, and that's another way in which this is a very reductive and misguided comparison. Hijab is not a garment. The hijab is a mode of conduct above all else. The hijab is about covering your body. It's about covering your body in a way so as not to tempt men sexually. And it's about not engaging in, not mixing with men, not having male friends, not having physical contact with men. Basically, essentially, living as, living as like it really does a number on you. Like, let me tell you that it really does a number on you. Like, after a while, because I had so much anxiety with all the policing and the way in which it felt like I couldn't move or speak or look in a way that could be interpreted incorrectly, lest it be deemed immodest. And I had so much anxiety and fear about it that at one point in my life, I just stopped trying to do anything but like drown myself in the baggiest clothes possible, especially because I have the type of body that is difficult to hide. It's a bit difficult to hide like the curves and stuff. And eventually I ended up disconnecting with my body so fundamentally that once I finally took the hijab off in my mid-20s, I couldn't even look at my limbs and recognize them as my own. And this is because these ideas were imposed upon me, by my school, by my culture, by my family, by the programming around me in such an overt way that there was no escaping it. There was no question of wanting to take my hijab off. Even if I had said that, like, I will still do everything else. I'll dress modestly. I'll wear long sleeves and I'll blah, blah, but like, I just don't want to wear the hijab. I don't want to just cover my hair. There would never have been a question. I would not have been allowed. And if I had tried, I would have faced, and I did try. I don't want to tell you what happened to me when I tried. And the trauma. And in some cases, like some people will say, in some families, they're like, you know what, you can do what you want, you can take it off, but no one's going to marry you. You're not going to be able to go to school. You're not going to be able to get a job. Just what is riding on it is, and to compare that to someone who chooses to take a nun's habit is just absolutely insulting. The other comparison, again, with the bikini thing, the last time I checked, no one had to wear a bikini, otherwise their physical safety and their access and their upward mobility and their social acceptance and their ability to have a community and their access to, to work and to basically any type of necessity that a person needs would be at stake last time I checked. Yeah. So, I think that's all I have. But yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yes.
So I actually was a real estate agent for the government of Saudi Arabia. I actually placed students that were here for the United States medical licensing exam for 10 years. And I had a lot of young women who came here. And one of the things that my job was to make sure that they had a home that was safe and close to where they were studying. They studied in Chicago for 18 months and then went on to take their test and then be matched wherever they were studying medicine. One of the things that I remember most interestingly in speaking to the forcing of wearing a hijab is it was August. It was 100 and maybe 5 degrees in Chicago. I was with a young man and his wife, and she was wearing a black hijab. She was wearing a black
niqab.
No, it's a burqa.
No, that's a niqab.
She was wearing a burqa. Right. It was 100 degrees, and we had a 5-block walk. And she had a baby, and the baby was in the stroller. And I'm like, she needs to be able to take this off. And he's like, no. And I'm like, then you should wear it because it's too hot. And he was like, how dare you? And I'm like, because it's offensive. And he was furious. It didn't stop me from getting more business. But then all the women loved me because they were like, because it went around. It's like, she's not going to like just stand for that. I did have a question for you. I mentioned that story. Start there because there's so many young women who come to the United States from their countries of origin. And they come into cities because they are going to school or they are having experience. How difficult is it for them to try to thread the needle when they're not around their families, when they can kind of have that freedom to live a little differently and then be able to go back to what can sometimes be considered restrictive in terms of their home life?
Yeah. So this is a very important question, and the answer is that it varies. It ranges like incredibly, and unfortunately, part of why it ranges is a function of privilege. Many of us are privileged enough to be able to have citizenship here or have a path to citizenship here. That makes all the difference, because when you know you are going back home, you have to basically navigate your life and make certain choices in line with knowing that your stay here isn't permanent. Others of us, others like basically because they are not as financially well off, or they know that the risk of losing the financial support of their family should it be discovered that they are living in a way that they are not supposed to be living, it just ends up not being worth the risk. And the unfortunate truth is that financial independence is something that is very, very hard to come by for many people from global Muslim communities, because of the communal nature of our cultures, because we do not have a history of women being in the workforce in the same way as in the United States. So financial independence, the right to work, the right to own and manage your own assets is something that is a very, very difficult battle and that many people cannot manage. If I was in Lebanon, I would not be able to be financially independent the way that I am here, simply because of the gender pay gap. It is one of the worst in the world. And this is because these are societies and communities built around the idea of a male breadwinner, the idea that a woman is supported by her father until she gets married. If she never gets married, she's supported by her father for the rest of her life. And then once she gets married, she's supported by her husband, which is also a very big obstacle for women who are in abusive situations or who have controlling husbands to divorce. They do not divorce because there's a lot of stigma attached to it. They would not be able to get remarried and they would not be able to support themselves. So I guess it very much varies on your situation, but for someone like me, I knew that because I have the privilege of having an American citizenship and because I have the privilege of having higher education, I was in a position to support myself. I knew that it would mean that I would be breaking away entirely from my community. It would mean that I would lose everything, because that's basically essentially what apostasy is for us. Either you navigate that gray space where you try to stay closeted and find the little bits of autonomy and joy that you can and hope that it doesn't come back to bite you in the ass, or you lose it all. And then you have to deal with the trauma of another form of estrangement and displacement when you are already estranged and displaced as someone from an immigrant background, which is, I think, most of us. It's not easy. And this is doubly why the community organizing that we do as ex-Muslims is so crucial, because we find a form of support with each other that we're not going to find elsewhere. So hope that answered your question. Yes, Tina.
What is the difference between a hijab and the
Okay. Okay, so the hijab is basically essentially covering everything but the hands and the face. In most schools of jurisprudence, it's basically you have to cover your hair, you have to cover your body in a way that, like, you know, no form-fitting clothing, modestly and so on, but not the face. The niqab is basically just the word for a face covering. It's usually black, but it can be other colors. It can show the eyes or not show the eyes. The burqa is a very, very specific form of dress that is used in Afghanistan. It is blue. It has a mesh cover. The blue one with the mesh cover, that is the burqa. Yeah, the black one that you see with the covered face, that is the niqab. Yeah.